Boa tarde para todas y todos y boa noite para o Michael, que en este momento se encuentra en Bologna. Sir Michael Leigh es un amigo de longa data, no mínimo 35 anos. Ele é formado em ciência política na Universidade de Oxford e tem doutorado também em ciência política no MIT. Ele fez uma longa carreira na Comissão Europeia, onde ele chegou ao posto de Diretor Geral. Posteriormente, ele foi pesquisador sênior do German Marshall Fund e, atualmente, ele dirige um programa de estudos europeus na Universidade Johns Hopkins, em Bologna. Michael apresentará para nós uma visão geral. Desde já você está avisado, já acho que já estava, falará em inglês, sobre a situação atual europeia, uma visão política ampla dos desafios que a União Europeia em particular confronta. Depois da apresentação e durante a apresentação, vocês podem enviar perguntas pelo chat. Eu tentarei ver, dado limitações de tempo, quantas e quais ele poderá responder, mas, por favor, sintam-se à vontade a escrever e estaremos organizando as perguntas de nosso lado. Michael, it is a real pleasure to have you again with us. Last time you was in Midrash physically, and now it's virtual, but always a pleasure having you. The virtual floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Bernardo, for the invitation. I have fond memories of my visit to Midrash, meeting with you, with Rabbi Bonda, and with the members just a couple of years ago. And although it's not quite the same sensation, I'm very happy to be with you again this evening and to be talking to you about a subject that is very close to my heart and, as you explained, has been at the center of my career for several years, namely Europe and more particularly the European Union. And this evening, I'll be talking about the response of Europeans to the change of leadership in the United States and the main challenges facing Europe in 2021. The defeat of Donald Trump in last year's election in the United States was in general met with a feeling of relief in Europe, even though sentiments were mixed. And there had been a number of countries where the people in power or leaders of the opposition had been strong supporters of Trump. This is true of some of the populist movements in Western Europe, but for example, Salvini in Italy went around with a Trump t-shirt and a Make America Great Again hat, also in Poland, in Slovenia, and in Hungary. But on the whole, and in Western Europe, the feeling had been that the Trump years were particularly difficult and that Trump had a disdain for European allies. And there were great hopes that with transition in the White House, there would be new prospects for cooperation. Biden is seen by many in the EU as perhaps the last Europeanist American president. He's somebody with a strong attachment to Europe, and he's a believer in shared transatlantic values. So there is an upspring of optimism in Europe, but at the same time, Europeans are cautious. They know that Trump may have left the White House, but that Trumpism is not dead. He himself, as we've seen through his maneuvers, yesterday and today, when he has carefully put himself forward as the key speaker in a major rally of the Republican Party in what looks like a bid to remain the leader of the Republican Party over the next 4 years, which is not self-evident for a defeated presidential candidate. So in Europe, there is a sense that either Trump himself or another leader rather like Trump may return in 2024. There's also awareness that the window of opportunity to develop close cooperation with the Biden administration is likely to be rather short. The United States faces midterm elections in 21 months from now. Campaigning will begin long before that. So basically, Biden has a window of opportunity of some 18 months only to make decisive changes from the position of the previous administration. And people in Europe know that during that period, domestic issues will be his top priority. Perhaps first and foremost, dealing with COVID. Just today, President Biden marked a 1-minute silence for 500,000 American deaths from COVID, more than all the American deaths in combat during the 20th century. In the European Union and the adjacent European Economic Area, countries like Norway and Iceland, which are not members of the EU but are closely linked with it, we have also had something more than 500,000 dead. And the United Kingdom, which is now outside the European Union, has had another 100,000 dead. So COVID will remain the top domestic priority for Biden, along with dealing with the activities of extremist groups, racial, ethnic tensions in the United States, and above all, the economy, which will be the key to his success in the midterm and the success of the Democrats in the midterm elections, which are rather soon. And therefore, Biden will have only limited bandwidth during this period for any foreign policy concerns. Still, Europe is likely to be fairly high on his priorities. For the EU itself, foreign policy is not an optional issue. Europe has a much more open economy than the United States. We are far more involved in trade with the rest of the world than the United States is. We are much more dependent on it. And our physical location is such that we have some pretty difficult neighbors. But just the same, COVID will remain the top of the political and economic agenda in Europe in 2021. One of the founding fathers of the European Union, Jean Monnet, who was an advisor to the French Prime Minister, Robert Schuman, who is credited with the famous declaration in 1950 that paved the way to the eventual European Union, has been quoted a lot recently in saying that Europe advances through crises. In other words, crises are opportunities. And there are many who see COVID in that light as well. And in fact, COVID broke 2 taboos in the European Union and led to breakthroughs that otherwise might have been unthinkable. The first taboo came in the field of public health itself. The 27 members of the European Union, it was 28 until the United Kingdom left, guard quite jealously areas of national competence for themselves. And until now, with just a few exceptions, public health has been the responsibility of national governments and not of the European Union. But in this crisis situation, the European Union took a number of bold initiatives and actually called for the EU to become a health union in which the most pressing issues of public health would be dealt with at the European level. And to single out the most evident example of this from the last half year, the question of vaccinations. At the start, when the COVID crisis hit, there was a pause before the European Union saw which area it could intervene in most effectively. And when it became clear that vaccination was really the path towards an exit from the epidemic, the EU took the decision that the European Commission would be the body that would negotiate with the big pharmaceutical companies and try and get commitments for the largest possible amount of vaccine to be delivered as quickly as could be done. The alternative to this would have been for the 27 member states each to have negotiated on their own behalf. And this would have exacerbated the economic differences among them, as the wealthier countries would have been able to obtain much larger supplies of vaccines much more quickly than the poorer countries. And indeed, the pharmaceutical companies would have been able to play off member states against each other. So the decision was taken that the EU itself in Brussels would do the negotiations, sign the contracts, and obtain the vaccines that would then be distributed to the member states. Unfortunately, though, the rollout of the vaccines has been much slower than expected for a number of reasons that we won't go into now. If you wish to raise questions, I'd be happy to deal with them. But the effect of this has been a kind of blame game in Europe as to who is responsible for the slow start. Comparisons are made with a number of people who have already been vaccinated in the United States, the United Kingdom, Israel, Chile, and other countries that have done rather better until now. And European leaders have come under criticism, particularly from populists, for being ineffective. Nonetheless, it looks to me as though the delay will be overcome within a period of 1 or 2 months. And some pretty reliable sources have estimated that by July, at least half of the population in the European Union should have been vaccinated. So this was one of the breakthroughs. And if this is something which is sustained in the future, there's likely to be a continuing role for the European Union in the area of public health. The other taboo that was broken as a result of COVID was on what is called sometimes in the shorthand Euro bonds. In other words, the idea that the European institutions in Brussels, particularly the Commission, would themselves raise money on capital markets by issuing bonds and then use that money to give grants and loans to the member states. And what happened last summer and autumn was that there was first an agreement between France and Germany, then taken over by the EU as a whole, that the EU would set up a recovery fund of 750 billion euros, and that this money would be used especially in the countries hardest hit by COVID, beginning with Italy and Spain, to fund the recovery. This money was included in the long-term EU budget, which doubled as a result. So the overall size of the EU budget increased through this exercise from something around 1% of gross domestic product to almost 2%. I can tell you that people in Brussels have been years and years arguing about a 0.1 or 0.15 increase in the budget, and small amounts were considered to be vital national interests, either by the advocates or the opponents of increased spending. And here, in one go, you had a virtual doubling of the EU budget. So this really was another major breakthrough. And according to the ideas of Jean Monnet, this could lead indirectly to other steps, because, for example, this money will sooner or later have to be repaid, or at the very least, the interest on the funds raised will have to be serviced by the EU. How are they going to pay for it? So there's talk that the EU now might introduce a new source of funding for itself through a European tax that could be used for ecological purposes, for example, a tax on carbon emissions, or a tax on the use of plastics, or some other progressive cause that would actually give the EU a taxing authority that it never held before. There's not a consensus yet on this or how it might work in practice, but it's just an illustration to you of the kind of breakthrough that has been achieved indirectly as a result of COVID. The main challenge now is how to spend all this money that has been allocated well. And if you've been following politics a little bit in Italy, you'll know that there has recently been a change of government, with Mario Draghi brought in as the new prime minister of a kind of unity government. And in a way, the main challenge in 2021 for this government is to spend these funds effectively. And the plan of the European Union is that the recovery fund should give a stimulus to the economy, although the overall fiscal stimulus is still somewhat modest, depending on the final amounts, but that the money should be spent on policy goals that the EU has fixed, in particular, the green and digital transition. In other words, ensuring that expenditure by governments in the future on infrastructure and other purposes upgrade the EU's capacity to meet the emission targets and other environmental protection targets that have been set, and also upgrade the EU's capacity for digital work across the continent. So the digital and the green transition are the main focus. And it will be Draghi's task, and that of the other governments, to see that the money is used for this and not spent as kind of slush funds, as we would say in England, to meet their own pet political projects. So this will be the top priority of Europe in 2021. And it will be looking to work together with the United States and with others on public health issues, and of course on the related economic issues. But I think when Europe looks to Biden and compares him with his predecessor, the main perception is that Biden is like-minded to Europe, particularly on issues like multilateralism, the importance of multilateral organizations in tackling international political and economic problems, something which Trump despised and in fact tried to destroy. With the return of the United States to the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, and to the Paris Climate Agreement, the Europeans are hoping that there will be new opportunities for close cooperation with the United States. And in December, the EU put forward an extremely ambitious agenda, setting forth a kind of menu on which Europe and the United States could cooperate in the future. At the same time, Europeans are not naive, and they know that a mere change of administration will not eliminate problems that have been there for some time. Excuse me for just a second. I have a little computer issue, which I will quickly. Wow. Technology is wonderful when it works, but as soon as it doesn't work, we realize how vulnerable we are. But I think that should be okay now. So despite the enthusiasm of Europeans for Biden and working together with him in multilateral settings, there is an understanding that these older issues will not disappear, and that indeed Democrats are to some extent more protectionist on trade issues than Republicans, at least traditionally. That's the way it used to be. So some of these long-standing trade disputes, for example, in the aircraft industry between Boeing and Airbus, where each side accuses the other of granting unfair subsidies, and where the WTO has given both sides the right to retaliate through imposing various additional duties. This is not going to go away. The tariffs that Trump imposed on imports of steel and aluminium from Europe will not go away. Disputes over data privacy, with the Europeans insisting on much higher levels of protection of the privacy of data handled by American big tech companies. This too will not go away. And the various ambitious approach of the Obama administration of trying to negotiate with Europe an ambitious transatlantic trade and investment agreement is unlikely to be repeated. Beyond the economic sphere, there are foreign policy issues on which Europe and the United States will not always see eye to eye. Iran, Russia, and perhaps the Middle East or aspects of the Middle East will be among these issues. But by far the most touchy issue between Europe and the United States in the years ahead will be China. The Biden administration is looking to Europe for very close cooperation on China and would like to see both sides of the Atlantic, the North Atlantic, develop common positions on key issues vis-a-vis China. Whereas the Europeans really want to make up their own mind, issue by issue. And I think the fundamental difference on China is that the United States views China essentially as a strategic challenge, even with defense and possible military implications. Whereas for the Europeans, we're not really present militarily in Asia Pacific, except for France and the United Kingdom, now outside of the EU, which do have a limited naval presence in Asia Pacific. But the Europeans are not present there, whereas for the United States, this remains an area of major strategic importance, and China is increasingly perceived as the major strategic rival for the United States. Europe views China much more from an economic perspective, and Europe is far more dependent than the United States on trade with China. Germany, for example, sends much more than half of all its exports to China. So the Europeans are always wanting to engage with China on trade issues. And in fact, they rushed ahead to sign a comprehensive agreement on investment with China at the end of the German presidency of the EU Council of Ministers in December, just before Biden came to power. We can debate this agreement, whether it gave Europe any leverage or not on human rights issues, on labor standards with China. But certainly those in the entourage of Biden felt that the Europeans could well have waited just 3 or 4 weeks in order, at least in terms of appearances, to consult and coordinate with Washington before signing this important agreement. For the Europeans, however, this was a demonstration that we could take our own decisions, and that in fact, in some respects, we were catching up with the United States that had signed a similar agreement with China a year before. So I think that the question of relations with China are going to be high on the agenda throughout this year and throughout the 4 years of the Biden administration. Opinions differ in Europe. There are those countries like Hungary, for example, or outside the EU, like Serbia, who are buying vaccines from China, as I know Brazil is, and who are engaging quite closely with China. And there are others who really perceive China more and more as an adversary and are trying to take their distance. In any event, this agreement was a major political coup for China that saw it to some extent as driving a wedge between Europe and the United States. In Europe, there's much talk these days of an idea that was originally French, but has been adopted by many in the European Union, and that is the concept of strategic autonomy. It was an idea that was started in France under General de Gaulle and really meant more national independence. And it's been adopted by President Macron to describe what should be the goal of the European Union vis-à-vis the rest of the world, but in particular, perhaps, the United States and China. In the French conception, which is shared by others, but not all, in the European Union, the notion of strategic autonomy means, first of all, that we should take more responsibility for our own defense. This is something that would be welcomed in the United States, especially if it meant stepping up to the target set by NATO for each member to spend 2% of its GDP on defense. But it also extends to areas like data protection, finance, and industry, with some wanting to shorten supply chains to make us less dependent on certain foreign suppliers. There are differences of views about strategic autonomy in the EU. Some see it as constructive, helpful, Europe standing on its own 2 feet, finally. But others, in Poland, for example, are afraid that it could weaken NATO. And the people in the Biden administration would welcome the concept if it really meant Europe spending more and taking more responsibility for defense. But they rather suspect that it has connotations of anti-Americanism on occasions, which they would deeply regret. I'll just mention very briefly 3 other challenges facing Europe in this first post-Trump year. The first is leadership in transition. The leadership of the European Union today is, in reality, the French president, the German chancellor, aided by the president of the European Commission. And there will be elections in Germany in September, and the different candidates to replace Merkel are already sizing up the situation. She is losing influence and is even criticized by some now, particularly on vaccines, in her own party. So we're entering this leadership transition period, and there will be elections in France next year. So before Mr. Macron takes any decisions, he too is going to think about what the implications are in electoral terms. The EU is more and more dominated by France and Germany since Brexit, since the United Kingdom left the European Union, with other larger member states like Italy and Spain not really being able to challenge them. Their economies have been hit so hard by COVID, and they face other challenges. Poland is the other larger member of the European Union, but because of backsliding on democracy, it's not likely really to challenge in any serious way the leadership given for the moment by France and Germany. The second challenge to watch this year is populism. The populists in Europe have had a bad pandemic. They have lost for the time being their trademark issue of immigration, because immigration has fallen so drastically during the period of the epidemic. But nonetheless, they are biding their time, and they have other issues that they may use as the basis for a comeback: anti-vaccination sentiment, anti-lockdown sentiment, which of course is linked also to jobs and income. And there are also concerns on the right in particular, the far right, that the emphasis being placed on the green transition, environmental issues, and climate could also come at the expense of jobs. And they're surfing on this issue to some extent to try and mobilize support from those who are already frustrated economically. The final issue that I'd mention as a challenge for this year, but there are many others, is how to cope with the after effects of Brexit. The United Kingdom, one of the three largest countries in the European Union, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a nuclear power, the sixth largest economy in the world, finally fully left the EU, the internal market, the EU customs union, on the 1st of January this year. But it negotiated only a paper-thin agreement with the European Union, with many, many issues still unresolved. In particular, the whole area of services, financial services and others, that account for 70% plus of the EU economy and the UK economy, are not effectively covered by this agreement. So the EU enters 2021 in a situation of more or less permanent negotiation with the United Kingdom, and this is an issue that is not going to go away. Of course, there are many other challenges. Our partners around the world, in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, each of these pose their specific challenges. But what I've shared with you this evening are the issues which are top of the agenda in Europe today. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. There are several questions that are on the table, and also from, call it, a more even Brazilian perspective. The first one, which for us is not obvious, is the relationship between the European Union and its principles and the grade of tolerance to some governments that self-define as illiberal democracies, especially having in mind Hungary and Poland. And each steps that those governments advance, you don't see, at least from outside, a clear reaction, positioning of the European Union's institutions and political bodies, how far they can go or how much they will tolerate. How is the game being played, which we don't see it from outside?
This is a great subject for concern in Europe. You know, the Europeans see themselves mainly in terms of their values, and the European Union likes to see itself as a normative power whose influence in the world is based on others' desire to emulate the European Union. And if we ourselves have major challenges about democracy, this is a challenge for the whole of Europe. Now, the way the EU tried to tackle this issue in 2020 was to impose economic conditionality on the funds that were going to go to Poland and Hungary out of the new budget and out of the recovery fund that I've talked about. There was going to be a rule of law conditionality attached to these funds. Because the feeling was that until now, the instruments that we have are too weak. We do have other instruments. For example, if a country is found to be systematically failing on some basic principles like the rule of law or democracy, it's possible for the Council of Ministers to suspend the voting rights of that country. But they must all agree to this. They must be unanimous. And basically, Hungary promised that it would always veto such a decision for Poland. And Poland promised it would always veto such a decision for Hungary. So instead, the effort was made to set up the kind of political conditionality on the very considerable EU funds that go to Poland and Hungary. Then, during the negotiations on the budget that I talked about, the special COVID recovery funds and the EU budget, basically Poland and Hungary threatened to block the whole budget if tough rule of law conditionality was imposed. Other countries insisted that it had to be done. So in the end, we had a typical EU compromise. The conditionality was adopted, but there were certain exceptions made. And in particular, it was agreed that we had to wait until certain cases, which are being considered by the European Court of Justice against Poland and Hungary, would be resolved before imposing this new mechanism. So the EU can say, look, we've adopted this mechanism, and in the future, we intend to condition these funds on better behavior by Poland and Hungary. But in reality, there's no sign of us doing that anytime soon. And I don't think the EU institutions at this point have enough strength or legitimacy to impose a solution to this problem. So I think it's going to be with us still for quite some time.
I see. Yeah, because it's quite impressive that to enter EU, in principle, you have a cahier de charge with a lot of conditionalities, especially not only, but also about political system. But from the moment you go into, it's not easy to put it also against out, you know. It's difficult to enter, but then it's difficult to take you out. It's quite interesting, the system, I would say, which makes it quite problematic in situations like the current one, where you can put pressure, but not so much somehow.
That's quite right, Bernardo. You'll remember my last job in Brussels was to be in charge of the membership negotiations with these countries. And we tried to be as tough as we possibly could during those negotiations, because we knew exactly what you said, that once they joined, we would lose this kind of leverage. I don't think when Poland and Hungary joined in 2004, or when Croatia joined in 2013, anybody foresaw the kind of democratic backsliding which has occurred subsequently. And it's true, we don't really have the toolkit to deal with it properly.
I see. You think that it may one day rise the issue about trying to strengthening the tools you mentioned, or?
Yes. I mean, we've just been through such an exercise. And in a way, it was the decision of the German Chancellor, Merkel, that it was more important to keep all the member states on board with the new EU budget than it was on this occasion to be very tough. And she was the one really who gave way and who found this kind of compromise, which in reality is not a compromise, because we don't have the teeth to deal with the issue, but we do have a legal basis for it. So if the political configuration changes in the future, we have another German chancellor with a different outlook, we're faced with new challenges, We do actually have the legal instruments now to deal with it. What we need is the political will.
I see. And you would say that eventually economic interest, even of Germany itself, in Eastern Europe can also influence decisions?
Only indirectly, and I would say mainly through the German contribution to the budget. You know, these countries have been receiving, since they joined in 2004, every year 3, 4, 5% at least of their GDP in transfers from the EU budget. And as Germany is the largest member state, it makes the largest contribution to that budget. So indirectly, Germany is providing them with funds. Under some future German government, there might be the feeling enough is enough. And there might be more political will to tackle the issue directly than there has been under Mrs. Merkel. We'll see.
I see. Thanks. Another issue, again from a Brazilian perspective, which is quite interesting for us, is, and of course it's a complex issue, but in a few words, how you explain the vaccination problem in Europe. We expected that Europe took the decision, had in principle the tools, but things really didn't move much, at least so far. What did happen, if you can simplify that?
I think what happened is that the European Union accepted a new responsibility in an area where it had very little previous experience. For the reasons I said earlier, it would have been much more worrying if 27 countries each tried to negotiate with the big pharmaceutical companies. You had Bulgaria trying to get a better deal than Romania and negotiating against Croatia, Luxembourg trying to negotiate its own supply of vaccines and so on. It made much more sense to do that for Europe as a whole. But the EU has never done this before. And it went into these negotiations in the spirit of a trade negotiation, you know. And the people doing the negotiations were actually trade negotiators. They were not people who had any particular experience dealing with pharmaceuticals. And in fact, their main objective in the negotiations was to get the best possible price. And because they were negotiating on behalf of 445 million people, in the end, they did manage to get a very good price from the pharmaceutical companies, a very competitive price. But they did not give equal attention during the negotiations to getting the companies to commit themselves to certain quantities of vaccines to be delivered on a tight schedule. And they accepted wording in the contracts with these companies, which basically said that the companies would make the best reasonable efforts to deliver the vaccines on time, but it was not a firm commitment by the companies. It was a best efforts commitment. The companies have done spectacularly well. There's been no other epidemic, no other vaccine that's been developed in such a short period. And one has to take off one's hats to them. It's a major achievement. But when it comes to ramping up production, and with all the difficulties of cold supply chains, particularly for the Pfizer vaccine, it has to be stored at -70 or -80, although that seems to be changing at the moment. The challenge for the Commission was enormous. It was in a new area. So I think that is the main reason why it was not more insistent. And these negotiations, which focused mainly on price, took a long time. So in the end, the EU concluded its contracts maybe 2 or 3 months after the UK did, for example, with the companies, and long after the Israelis completed their negotiations. So I think that we have between a 2 and 3 month delay in deliveries, which of course translates into more cases and even into more deaths. So I'm not trying to minimize the significance of this, but I do think that Europe will have started to catch up by the end of next month. And during the second quarter, I think Europe will have caught up. And I've seen one estimate, which I think is rather optimistic, but it's a serious estimate by a serious organization, that by July, Europe should have vaccinated some 60% of its population. Let's see if we can deliver on that. So there are a number of reasons for this delay, Bernardo.
Thank you. Thank you. No, for me, at least, did clarify a lot. And then we will always know more details what really happened. But you gave a very good overview. Our common friend, John Wilkinson, is asking, what is the state of play of the European Union-Mercosur trade agreement?
John, I can't say hello to you because I can't see you, but thank you very much for your question. This is not an issue, I must say, immediately that I followed in great detail. But my overall impression is that the negotiations have been concluded to all intents and purposes. They've been effectively concluded, and that the agreement includes a certain amount of conditionality on issues that are important to the European Union, but also to the Mercosur countries, on labor standards and on environmental protection in particular. And that there is great concern in the European Union about whether on the Mercosur side, there's going to be enforcement of the conditionality, particularly on environment. And President Macron of France has been particularly outspoken on this. You know, it seems that 2020 was the worst year for a very long time in terms of destruction of the Amazon. And this has attracted a lot of attention in Europe. And I think that concerns about the environment are probably the biggest single factor that is now holding back the final conclusion of the Mercosur agreement.
Thank you very much. I have a final question here, which is quite complex because it has different aspects, and it has to do with Turkey. As we well know, there are problems in relation to the European Union, the conflict between Turkey and Greece on one side. There is Turkey changes his position in the Middle East, becoming a main political actor in the region. There is the tension between Turkey and Israel, which in the last weeks, there were some news that there was some type of effort of reapproximation. It's not obvious how and why. But Turkey is, and also if we look the world after Trump, it looks like Trump was rather friendly to Erdogan, or not confronting him. And here is, but what after Biden, what you in Europe in relation to Erdogan, to the Middle East conflict in general, because the question relates both issues. If you can give an overview about the challenges that the European Union faces in relation to Turkey, and how after Trump can somehow change the relative position of Turkey in the game.
Well, the European Union has very close relations with Turkey. It's one of our main trading partners. And for the last 20 plus years, 22 years, Turkey has been a candidate for EU membership and has been negotiating with the European Union the terms of its membership since 2005. So the heart of the institutional relationship between the EU and Turkey is based on its application for membership. But these negotiations have not been very successful. They've been going very slowly. And in fact, for the last 3 years, they have pretty much been suspended de facto. for a number of reasons, but mainly because of the internal situation in Turkey, the repression, the drift towards authoritarianism, the weakening of the rule of law. All of these factors are fundamental to the European Union, and they have led, or they have increased, the existing skepticism that there was in a number of member states about whether Turkey could ever in reality become an EU member because of the number of challenges that it poses. So this has been the fundamental situation which has slowed down these negotiations. And as long as these negotiations were not getting anywhere very fast, there was a kind of mutual feeling of disappointment and reproach, with each side blaming the other. Then Turkey and the EU found that there were important issues on which they could cooperate nonetheless, like migration, particularly because of Turkey's geographical position and the very large number of refugees from Syria and elsewhere, from Afghanistan and from other more distant countries, who found their way into Turkey on their way to the European Union. And the EU negotiated an agreement with Turkey whereby we would finance quite a part of the support for the refugees in Turkey. We would also, if we could, speed up Turkey's membership talks with the EU and make progress in other areas in return for Turkey's continued efforts to support those asylum seekers and economic migrants in Turkey. Turkey, on the other hand, constantly complained that the EU was not living up to its obligations, and from time to time threatened to open the doors so that these refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants would, as in 2015, move on through Greece and the Balkans into the European Union. So migration has been, in a way, an issue for cooperation, but also for great tensions over all these years. On top of all of that, there are some of the issues that you mentioned. Turkey's rather aggressive position that didn't align itself with Europe's position, Europe itself being divided to some extent on Libya, on Syria, and more recently, Turkey's position on the Eastern Mediterranean, and in particular, its refusal to accept the exclusive economic zone of the Republic of Cyprus, which is a member of the European Union, and its challenge also to parts of Greece's exclusive economic union, exclusive economic zone, which it claimed to be part of Turkey's continental shelf. So Turkey has been sending exploration vessels into waters that the EU considers to be part of the EEZ of Cyprus and of Greece. And it has also sent naval vessels into Greek and Cypriot waters to accompany those vessels which are exploring for oil and gas in the region. And this has led to increased tensions as well. So all of this has meant that the EU's accession process with Turkey has gone onto the back burner. The EU has come up with various ideas for a positive agenda with Turkey. There are many issues we could be working on other than membership, like deepening the customs union we have with Turkey. Turkey is part of the EU's customs territory, but that doesn't cover agriculture, doesn't fully cover services. Let's work on this. Let's work together more on migration, on counterterrorism, on security, on intelligence sharing. There's an agenda out there where we could work together. But as long as Turkey pulls these surprises in its foreign policy, just today there have been incidents in the air, in the Aegean, in which it looks as though Turkish planes might have, as they do so often, violated Greek airspace. These kind of issues that occur so frequently it means that there's a constant air of tension, and we simply can't make progress either on the membership pillar or on the positive agenda that is out there. Very briefly and more generally on the Middle East, I think the change of administration in Washington brings the White House more into line with European positions on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The Europeans have always supported a two-state solution, which Biden supports as well, whereas the Trump administration, at least de facto, supported the position of the Israeli government that many in Europe believe precluded a two-state solution. So there'll be more common thinking there on this issue. I don't think the Biden administration will reverse in any way the breakthroughs that Trump achieved in establishing diplomatic relations between Israel and a number of Arab states. But I think Biden is more likely to use those links to try and focus back onto the Palestinian issue, which Trump had pretty much neglected. And the Europeans would be keen to cooperate with Biden on that.
I see. Michael, thank you very much indeed. Your presentation, as always, was clear. Even it's true, it's not only because I like you intellectually, the way you think, but also it's open and shows the different challenges and not easy solutions, which is the reality of politics. If you are not, if you don't go into demagogic narrative, we know that challenges don't have clear-cut solutions, and your presentation is really always excellent. In the name of Midrash, of the public, also Raf Bonder send you his regards. Thank you very much, and hopefully next year in Rio de Janeiro.
Thank you so much, Bernardo. It was my pleasure.
Thank you, Michael. Bye.